Welcome to the Beyond Canopy, the podcast where we dive deep into the tools, stories, and innovations driving ecosystem restoration and impact-driven investments. I'm Alexander from OpenForests Explore.land, and today we're exploring one of the biggest questions in the restoration space. So up to 40% of the world land is degraded, and the need is huge. So how can we unlock substantial funding for large-scale landscape restoration? And how to scale from a project view towards a more holistic landscape approach? So how to connect finance and landscapes in a more responsible way? Our guest today is Alejandro Diaz. He's landscape finance manager at Commonland. It's an organization pioneering the 4 returns framework, which is a powerful approach or methodology that is rooted in the theory of change. And the goal is to restore landscape ecosystems while creating value for local communities, increasing biodiversity and other ecosystem services. For example, water retention, soil protection, but also, of course, stability of the local temperatures. So for this to happen, the idea is to build synergies between landscape stakeholders such as farmers, communities and municipalities, local businesses, and the private sector such as investors, philanthropy, but potentially also corporate businesses. And Alejandro supports landscape partners in designing investable landscape restoration projects and helps developing financing models that blend capital types and unlock potential funding. So welcome, Alejandro. Great to have you on the podcast. And yeah, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Really nice to be here and to chat. So yes, my name is Alejandro. You can call me Ale. I'm a landscape finance manager here at Commonland. I've been in the organization for 4 years now, as of this week exactly. So it's it's
Birthday.
nice. I think plenty to talk about. And it's been really a learning process. My background is more generally in business and finance. Started more traditional, working at a bank in Canada, where I spent a lot of time living where I studied and where I then worked for some years. Then going into more broadly development finance, so not nature specific, let's say, but already looking into these blended finance solutions, innovative finance models, and so on. And indeed, after 4 years or so, that organization is called Convergence. And after 4 years there, I moved to Commonland. So indeed, as you mentioned, I'm a landscape finance manager. The whole idea with the team and my role is to support landscape partners with mobilizing financial resources, essentially. So bottom line is we try to connect these interventions, programs to investors, in some cases to public financiers as well, private financiers, and mobilize some capital.
Yeah.
It's a work in progress, but happy to get into it a little bit more.
Yeah. So I think we already started to go a little bit into it, and maybe we should really start with the difficult question. So we know landscape degradation is one of the root causes of climate change, biodiversity loss, and poverty. But why is it so hard to mobilize capital for restoring these landscapes?
Yes, so I think for us at Commonland, really the main thing is making it holistic and place-based and large scale. So when we're talking about holistic, just to be on the same page, we're referring to looking at all kinds of activities across a particular area. Usually we look at maybe 50,000 hectares and more. We support some landscapes that look at 1 million hectares. So
Mm.
very large areas
Yeah.
that have, of course, many underlying activities. In some cases, those activities might be degrading, contributing to degradation. In other cases, might be contributing to restoration.
Yeah.
Uh, all equally important to look at. And so, considering the way in which these different interventions, activities interact with each other is very important. In some cases, there might be interventions that maybe cancel each other out. There's little collaboration, synergies that could be found. And so it's uh, a lot of work in first
Mhm.
bringing together organizations, bringing together stakeholders across, you've mentioned farmers, could be businesses, local government, engaged citizens, uh, maybe national park authorities. They're all active. They all have a view and voice and want to restore their landscapes, but maybe don't really meet each other. And so,
Mhm.
first of all, is bringing these entities, these individuals together. That makes it tricky for capital mobilization because, as you can imagine, in some cases there's revenue generating activities, in some cases there's not. So you might require maybe 5,000 euros for in grant funding for a small intervention around maybe bringing together folks at an event. Whereas in other cases, you might be looking at a 10 million euro project that maybe requires debt finance. And so, how do you present that? Do you bring it together as like a package? You're talking about different kinds of finance flows, therefore different capital providers. So it's tricky from the get go. How do you, yeah,
Yeah.
showcase the interventions?
Yeah.
Uh, A- And to start, who's funding the keeping the lights on for an entity that is doing the coordination itself? Those organizations are typically the ones that we're supporting at Commonland, landscape partnerships,
Yeah.
let's say, um, that require core funding, ongoing, largely unrestricted, flexible funding to do uh, this initial work.
Yeah. 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 Great. So, what I hear is there are different stakeholders with different interests. Sometimes they are really aligning. Sometimes there could be contradicting these interests, and they all have a different background. So different understanding potentially of the problem, a different language they use in their day-to-day business. Um, but how to bring this together? And maybe now my question: how does Commonland's for Returns framework help to address these challenges?
Yeah. So I think, and going back to, because it's holistic, these different activities first need to be identified and mapped. So landscape partnerships do a great job in playing that intermediation role. That's a core part of the for returns framework. This locally grounded, locally based, and locally led entity who is driving that effort. Um, but again, back to your point of mobilizing resources, perhaps before going to the for returns framework a little bit more. Um, Important to distinguish what kinds of resources, because it's very different to mobilize, let's say, philanthropy and grants from, or let's say, maybe bigger scale investment capital. Um, because we're looking at landscape level work and different kinds of interventions, all are relevant. And so, uh, my role in particular is more oriented to private sector mobilization. We tend to look at the investment opportunities within the landscape. And to be frank, I think part of the problem is how the current even economic system and how investment decisions are being made, because they tend to um, allocate resources in a very sector oriented. It's actually difficult if you're, let's say, talking about maybe funds being set up, to find anything that's maybe very place based
Mhm.
or very locally grounded. And
Yeah.
so, what do you present, and how do you address the fact that maybe there's contingencies with some of the investment opportunities that require a completely different set of funds and different kind of capital, but is required for it all to work in conjunction. So that's part of the difficulty,
Yep.
but making clear that essentially the sum of the parts is greater than one when they're all working together. You're mapping the interventions and not working in isolation.
Yeah.
And so part of the forward returns framework and what Commonland aims to do and to support is in driving these efforts forward, bringing these parties together. The forward returns framework is essentially looking at how do you bring stakeholders together, develop a common vision, having a shared understanding of what needs to happen in the landscape, developing a plan to do that,
Yeah.
and implementing it, and looking at four returns in order to make it holistic. So return of inspiration, very
Mhm.
important. How do you bring back hope and inspiration, a sense of uh, belonging, sense of connection to that landscape?
And this
Social
is
experience.
also quite unique for the four returns model. So with the usual models, you like have the triple bottom line with social, economic, and environmental, but you also added the inspirational part, right?
Indeed. Yeah, we see it as the main driver. It's
Yeah.
what's really making it happen and what will sustain it long term. Because you
Yeah.
can have all of these other, views and benefits, but in our view, if the, let's say, local communities, local actors don't have, let's say, that connection, that sense, or that ownership around it, it'll be difficult to sustain it longer term. So it's probably the one where, yeah, we pay definitely much more attention to than other actors, or we try
Mhm.
to highlight it more.
You- Yeah.
And of course, that is combined with social returns, natural returns, financial returns. So having this holistic lens around programs as opposed to a narrower view, highlighting that, it needs to be integrated.
Yeah. So you mentioned the four returns. So this is like the inspirational, social component, natural capital, and financial returns. Um, that is more like the roadmap that you agree to, together with the stakeholders on. So the pathway, how to where you want to get. So the vision at the horizon. Um, but in order to make it possible, so like a landscape initiative ready for funding, what needs to be in place before supporting in terms of maybe desk review, governance structure, management plans, financial structures. So for example, if there's a landscape with some actors, how do you support them towards connecting maybe with some funders, maybe philanthropy first, and then connect them, build them further towards more professional funders. What is your approach? So maybe you can give an example or outline how that works.
Yeah, I think talking about an example kind of brings it to make it a little bit more concrete. Um, so when we're talking about mobilizing resources, there is an underlying entity that needs to absorb that capital.
Mhm. Yeah.
We talk about landscape sometimes in an abstract way, but of
Mhm.
course, in the end, it's one, individuals and organizations. So different kinds of entities. Some of those entities are potentially business cases or maybe a specific, project entity that can absorb investment capital. So investment in this case, very specifically being debt, equity. So the type of resource that needs to be repaid and likely with some type of financial return.
Mhm.
Um, and so you need appropriate structures to absorb that. That implies that there needs to be a legal entity
Mhm.
ideally locally grounded, locally led, who can do that. Plus this need to absorb, let's say, grant funding, whether it's from philanthropy or from public resources. Even philanthropy has a lot of constraints, right, and requirements. What kind of entity do you need to be? Do you need to be a charity, a registered charity? Do you need to be an association? Do you need to be, maybe in some case, have some connection with maybe government, on the public side? So you can imagine all of these entities forming an ecosystem of partners within a landscape having different roles. So where Commonland comes in is in identifying or supporting the identification and bringing all of these organizations together to first, again, develop a vision around what's going to happen. What do all of these entities and individuals want to happen for the
Mhm.
next 20 years in that landscape?
Wow.
Once you
Yeah.
have that, because it's long term, it's it's landscape level restoration. It's not going to happen overnight. So that's point one. And then developing, of course, what's the plan? Maybe for the next year, 3 years, 5 years. Around that, then you can start implementing or creating some of the entities that are still needed to be created, or doing business development, doing project development. That is where, let's say, our team as landscape finance is well positioned to then come in and support. So we will go through a process. Right now, this is something that we're, for example, piloting in the Altiplano Estepario landscape in Spain, to essentially identify all of the interventions that the landscape partners are working on and their financing needs. And so it's very simple, actually. It's data collection, but standardized. And so then these underlying organizations are contributing information that very specifically looks at what kind of finance they need, how much do they need, when, for how long, from whom, ideally. And then we can start making assessments of, maybe this could be commercial, it's revenue generating, there's sufficient cash flow potential there to maybe repay a commercial loan. Great. Maybe this requires equity. Most of them are actually interventions that need grant funding. So let's look at that: public funding, philanthropy, and then you can get a really good picture of what is needed. With that input, so you're just answering what is needed, then we can support finance strategy development. So let's bring that to, how are you going to actually fundraise for it? Are there sufficient investors and donors that are maybe interested, for maybe through funds that already exist, public maybe programs and so on, subsidies? And if not, then how do you tackle it? Do you develop something new? Do you maybe try to put together a new project? Are there maybe additional interventions that need to be developed by the local partners, not by Commonland? We're just supporting this process. And then once you have that strategy, then I think it's way more effective to then go out to the market with this really good understanding of what is needed, as opposed to developing something maybe from a more top-down sense or approach, where funds get set up and maybe, 50, 75, 100 million euros, that then is difficult to allocate, because there is maybe little identification of pipeline ahead of time, little absorption capacity within landscapes. And so it's difficult to find these opportunities. If we do it the reverse way, so first identifying what the needs are and then setting up relevant and appropriate solutions, then we can start to bridge that a little bit more.
Yeah, cool. Super interesting. So let me quickly recap. So we have like a complex landscape with different stakeholders, and these different stakeholders have different financial requirements. So let's say also on the level how they are developed. So some stakeholders might need some training, so they need grant for training. Others others have a farm and they want to expand the farm, lease more land for regenerative agriculture, so they need a loan to do that. Yeah. Maybe there's a consortium of a cooperative that wants to have a more professional investor that gave them a bigger loan for longer period. That could be an option. And so my question is, there also collaboration with corporate that like a landscape could feed into their supply chain? So because you mentioned Altiplano in Spain, which we had the chance to visit like 2 years ago with the team, there were a lot of almond plantations, and I think that's a really valuable product also for the industry. And getting access to sustainable almond supply chain might be interesting also for corporates. So I mentioned now philanthropy, loan, maybe equity. Maybe there's also like a corporate partnership possibility with landscapes. So
Yeah.
what's your view on that?
No, definitely. And it's super interesting right now because of these. I think there is more of this recognition across corporates and more initiatives looking into this. But even these disclosure setting organizations like TNFD or target setting like SBTN are already looking at landscape engagement targets,
Yeah.
for example, and putting out guidance and around for corporates around how to do this in financial institutions as well. So I think it's increasingly going to be happening that there's going to be inbound requests to landscape partnerships such as
Absolutely.
Albelal from corporates who want to do this. Not only, but for sure, this is the biggest driver in terms of supply chain resilience and securing, products, key commodities that they need, but also because of these landscape engagement targets and needing to really go beyond just maybe net zero and cleaning up their own supply chain, but looking at what is happening around it. Which landscapes are you active in? How are you supporting the broader landscape restoration effort, the holistic landscape restoration effort, and not only your own supply chain? So we start to see that, but it still, I think, tends to be more focused from a supply chain security perspective and risk perspective, as opposed to the more proactive landscape engagement side. But ideally, you have corporates that have the capacity to sign, really good offtake agreements, providing a premium and therefore an incentive for farmers to transition to certain practices, and that's rewarded also in the market. So people being willing to pay that additional price for the benefits, and that also implies that there's a way to measure and track these other additional benefits, maybe around biodiversity, around water, carbon, of course. And so these conversations start to happen. I think it's important to, again, go beyond maybe supply chain and security and procurement, but including these corporates who are key landscape actors as well in the broader conversations, and then facilitating their resources to be linked to maybe a financial institution locally that can provide maybe a cheaper loan because of the offtake agreement. And maybe that can be, again, blending, right? It can be guaranteed by the local government to a certain extent, again, lowering the price, maybe providing some additional flexibility to farmers and the SMEs from the landscapes in order to facilitate that transition. But for sure, we see that happening.
Yeah. Yeah. So what becomes obvious is that it's a super complex system, landscape, due to the environmental conditions, due to the stakeholders, and it's nothing that you can restore within a typical investment cycle of 3 to 5 years. So you really need patient capital to do so. can you explain what it is and why it matters in landscape, and maybe also how you convince funders to become more patient than they are in general?
Yeah, tricky one. But essentially, yeah, when we think about patient capital, I guess it can be twofold. One, of course, the tenor, like when are you asking for a return on that money, or for the money itself to be paid back? In many cases, this goes back to, what is our current system asking for, and you can take it back to asset owners and, pension funds and insurance companies or individuals
Mhm.
who typically want to see some potentially recurring income, or maybe already principal back, their money back. And those timelines tend to be short. So 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. Long-term funds, 7, 10, 12 years, increasingly, 10 plus. But when we're looking at landscape restoration, you need at least 20 years to make, a dent at landscape level. It's ecological restoration. And
Yeah.
sometimes those timelines, again, misalign. So you could have 12 years being a long time for, let's say, a fund. We and
Yeah.
we would advocate for evergreen structures or permanent structures, but where that is, yeah, maybe not possible because of current system, um, you assume that an investment cycle will be 7, 8, 9 years max, which means you invest and then all the activities happen in order for you to get the return that you're looking for, and you exit that investment in order to be able to get paid as an
Mhm.
investor.
Yeah.
So that assumes that the cycle is very fast.
Yeah.
So that's part of the problem. And so when we're looking at, again, patient capital, can we look at permanence? Can we look at 15-year cycles, 20-year cycles, maybe different innovative structures with having some liquidity available, maybe through blending or market mechanisms that can facilitate that, but keeping the
Yeah.
money in landscapes long term, and
Yeah.
ideally, or for value add that is being created, to also remain um, in the landscapes.
Yeah.
So different ways of doing it, but yeah,
Yeah.
just being more flexible.
Yeah, yeah. So let's say it's difficult to convince very conventional investors with short-term horizons, because landscape projects are not bankable in the common sense. So, and I see that we have to be a little bit more innovative in the financing mechanisms. So, and yeah, you just described already a few one, how you support them from philanthropy, loans, and things like that. Um, what about, for example, outcome-based finance? So where you invest into carbon credits, biodiversity credits, water funds. That could be one category. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, on outcomes based, the implication is that we can measure that
Mhm.
and in a reliable way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of organizations who are working on this, on the um, tracking, measurement, and monetization of maybe these, um, for example, ecosystem services or other kinds of impact. But yeah, I think the difficulty is in setting up structures where you find a buyer
Yeah.
for it, and that doesn't maybe outsource the risk or put the burden on, maybe, for example, a farmer who's
Hmm.
already taking significant amount of risk.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you do outcomes based and something happens, there's a catastrophe, maybe there's a drought, and you
Yeah.
don't meet maybe some threshold, how do we navigate that? But we definitely have to go in. So there's a lot of, things to figure out. But I think it's
Mhm.
going in the right direction. There's a lot of interest in
Yeah.
it. And at the end of the day, I think if we don't start measuring this more and become better at it, and again, put the risk where it's really absorbable and where it's meant to be and on who it's meant to be, then we can unlock some of these additional revenue streams and incentives for farmers, uh, measuring these externalities. Right now, that's a big gap. If you look at maybe a landscape, the landscape economics and the transition economics would work quite well if you could measure these externalities, positive externalities, and pay the people who need to be
Yeah.
paid for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you see the possibility that the new CSRD directive might close this gap? Because a landscape, so when we talk about Altiplano in Spain, I know it's more than 1 million hectares or something like that. And part of the landscape, there are also companies, corporates doing their business there, which might be subject to the CSRD. Do you see that there might some sources coming from this new directive that might flow into the landscape and help to restore them?
I think already, again, going back to your question around corporates, for sure, there's more interest. Um, that'll probably continue to happen. When I think in the case of, for example, the Altiplano, I think the biggest leverage points continue to be also on the public side, though. So how do we shift maybe certain subsidies, maybe the cap? What is it incentivizing? Can we maybe inform public policy so that farmers get incentivized in the right direction? Let's in the concept of the Altiplano and Albelal towards regenerative organic practices. It starts to happen, for example, around water, like swales, for example. Now you can get subsidies for it. But then looking at what is the surrounding ecosystem for it, do farmers know how to implement swales? Is there appropriate machinery for it, equipment? How do you go out in the right way, right? Facilitating that. So we'll need to look at corporates contributing to that, public side contributing to that, philanthropy as well, consumers. So I think it does need to be across the board, and but it's going in the right, I think, direction.
Direction, yeah.
Of market
Yeah,
shifts.
yeah, cool. So we at OpenForests, because we work with tools, we develop explore.land, and also Commonland is using it to visualize their initiatives on a map to show progress and help to communicate internally. So therefore, my question is really regarding tools and frameworks. Are there anyone who are particularly helpful for you to organize these complex structures?
So I mentioned the process, kind of like this stepwise work that we've been doing, especially recently. So one is it's essentially we call it a finance assessment, but it's data collection. It's standardized data collection. So not super complex, but if we can combine that with, for example, like Explorerland and other web-based platforms that can visualize that information and map it. So for example, we do collect coordinates, but right now it's an Excel sheet. We don't have the capacity, or we haven't, gone to that point of everything that you input in real time shows up and really gives you a nice visualization and a dashboard around the financing needs and what kind of project it is and if it's revenue generating or not. So the more that we can take these kind of simple tools, and
Mhm.
I think it needs to be simple
Sure.
initially at least, but indeed then maybe combining them, right? And if you have, instead of an Excel, you have a nice web-based application, for example, like Explorerland, then you also benefit more and more quickly because there's no value in just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. We need to do something with it. Let's show it. Let's put it in front of people who maybe are looking for these projects, who have capital to to allocate and reach them, I think the biggest benefit or value that we see in the tools that we're using is in the standardization and in making it easier to tell that story and to communicate what it is that landscape partners are working on. But the underlying value and the tools are still the work on the ground. So from a landscape finance perspective, it's just, let's take that, let's see what is needed
Mhm.
and communicate it in a clear and
Yeah.
consistent way.
Yeah. So you have kind of a landscape investment readiness assessment. So, for example, if a funder approached you and said, I want to do something, I don't know, in Mexico, in Spain, South Africa, you have different impact dimensions that you're supporting with your projects. What can I do? And is there a way to see how ready a landscape is to take on the investment? So in the beginning, you mentioned there has to be like a financial infrastructure for distributing the funds to the different levels. So is there a way how you measure it and communicate that to potential investors?
I think so far it continues to be at intervention level.
Mhm.
We talk about landscape finance and tracking all finance flows that are relevant,
Yeah,
but it's also extremely complex to be able to
yeah,
set something up that is indeed landscape finance per definition,
mhm,
because that implies you need philanthropy, you need public finance, you need private. Just the effort of coordinating that into a single maybe structure is just potentially too much. It's not maybe not needed.
yeah, yeah,
So right now, that process becomes more, okay, we've identified the interventions. There
mhm,
are appropriate and commercially viable business cases. Let's connect those business cases to the appropriate investors. Let's
mhm,
connect the projects that require maybe grant funding to philanthropists. Let's influence maybe or try to train or strengthen capacities within landscapes in order to be able to access existing flows
yeah,
of finance.
yeah,
But so far, we haven't really, there's no landscape finance examples per se.
yeah,
But I think increasingly, and we're working on a couple of different, in a couple of different landscapes to
mhm,
serve maybe key activities or key interventions that do require some maybe more niche or more specific uh, blended finance mechanism,
yeah,
because it's a leverage point in the landscape,
yeah,
perhaps. May call it transition finance for farmers. So
yeah,
you do have to we do narrow it down to a more concrete and more simple problem, and then find a solution for that problem in the context and informed by the broader holistic landscape restoration program. So it's still not creating a blend, let's say a finance mechanism or a solution in isolation. It is informed by all the conversations that we've been having,
mhm,
informed by the local partners. It's locally led, locally grounded, so that when it does get created, if it gets created, it is able to tackle some of the challenges that have been identified, and the finance can be absorbed uh, appropriately.
yeah. Cool. So as I understand, at the moment you identify problems and solutions on the intervention level, and then you seek funding, especially to remedy or improve these specific areas. For example, reduce pesticides in plantations, something like that. What do the farmer needs to become organic farmers, and they might have like a transition time. And is this an example? And then you basically you select, let's say, areas where you have a relatively high leverage and where basically also you have a matching funder, because maybe one alone is for a transition towards organic. For a training you might need grants. Yeah, is that correct?
Correct. It
Mm.
just really depends on the intervention,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
there is it while it's intervention specific, let's say,
Mhm.
it's indeed important to look at the broader landscape and the broader, let's say, call it system uh, that you're active in. So let's if you look at the landscape as a system, then what is the leverage point within that landscape? Is it agriculture and farmer practices? Is it maybe, I don't know, in some cases it might be the natural zone restoration efforts. In other cases, maybe it's education. And then based on that, then you can create a solution that is maybe specific for that challenge, but it is informed by all of the other activities within the landscape. It's
Okay.
driven by the landscape partnership.
Got it. Yeah.
So it's not you have a project and let's fund that project.
Yeah.
It's you have this problem and leverage point. How do we address this? Informed also and influenced by the system.
Yeah.
And so that's the key, I would say, or one of the key value adding capabilities of landscape partnerships. They're embedded in the landscape. They know the landscape better than any external entity might, and have the right conversations with the local actors that need to be involved.
Yeah. Yeah. So I myself see more actors appearing in this landscape sector. So we work with the Wiz Academy for Nature. I see that Rockefeller philanthropy advisors are interested in developing possibilities for landscape financing. When you speak with funders through Commonland, do you see a tendency or funders being more interested in financing landscapes at that point?
I do. I'm more on the investment side.
Mhm.
So I know for sure in the philanthropy there Commonland has really good experience with it and
Mhm.
advocating also for flexibility in the funding. So
Mhm.
beyond what it's allocated to, let's say holistic landscape
Yeah.
restoration, it's how, and the how is process level. So again, unrestricted, flexible, long-term, recurring core funding that is critical for the continuation of landscape partnerships.
Yeah.
On the grant side, let's say
Yeah.
philanthropy.
Yeah.
On the investment side, I think it's still, while there's more familiarity with it, and familiarity including why it would be beneficial to do this and the challenges that might be associated with it. I think it's still not there yet in terms of, investors being open and understanding and allocating to landscapes. It's very nascent still, very little funding that gets allocated in this way. So we have to, for example, tend to look at environmental and, let's say, nature finance, nature-based solutions, conservation finance, or let's say agri finance. There's no bucket that is,
Yeah.
let's say, restoration finance or like landscape finance. So hopefully that continues to evolve. But so far it's still challenging.
Yeah. And do you have like an idea of how that could be made possible? Oh,
I think the more familiarity with it, the more it's embedded into directives, target setting. There's an ability to also measure things, so landscape level economics,
yeah.
understanding of landscape finance, understanding of implications, synergies, risks, of why you need to do an assessment that goes beyond a supply chain and look at the whole landscape, the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
Then there will be more and more awareness, probably
Yeah.
leading to capital allocation. And there are examples, don't get me wrong, but it's still quite small.
Okay. And do you see it also in the space of public-private partnerships so that governments de-risk, yeah, private engagement there? Is this also an important component of it?
Definitely. And part of the problem is you communicate to those different actors in different ways. So
Yeah.
we need tools that serve the needs and understanding of maybe public actors, national, subnational. You need tools that maybe serve the needs of corporates, financial institutions, asset managers, local actors, farmers, and everyone is kind of playing different roles. So, but yes, definitely, in the end, if organizations can find ways and agree on how to measure maybe ecosystem services,
Yeah.
and that is embedded into maybe a public policy that is then leading to allocation of resources to a landscape level kind of ecosystem services scheme, then that can then de-risk, or those concessional or public resources can de-risk investment into that type of transition finance. And yeah, there could be a really nice system, and then you have a corporate acting as off-taker, lowering the risk, and then the local actors get the resources required, but in ways that are absorbable.
Yeah.
It cannot be extremely expensive. It just
Yeah.
won't happen. If it's
Yeah.
very difficult and expensive and time intensive as well, to, let's say, get a loan, like
Yeah.
maybe it needs to be a part of the cap, needs to be a subsidy, or needs to be a grant, or it needs to be a much cheaper loan.
Yeah, I'm trying to recap because we're coming slowly to an end of our conversation. So what I hear, I so there are a lot of aspects, but certainly we need like a governmental framework, be it on country level, be it on European level, that sets the boundaries and the structure to support landscape restoration finance. That is one component. Another component I hear, we need transparency, data, and a way to measure progress in a transparent and also standardized way, so that it's not just very specific for one location, so that financial institutions could apply it to a bigger portfolio. And the third point, I've forgotten. No,
I have
I think
as well.
the third point was that we also need like innovative financing mechanisms, no? Be it through carbon credits, be it through be it other compensation mechanism, be it tax exemptions for doing a positive impact in the landscape. And having said that, also maybe to connect supply chains of corporates better with the local actors under, again, sustainability assumptions, so that, for example, timber processing, almond production, cocoa production, all these things that used to be conventional and harming the environment and the landscapes, brought to a more sustainability level. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
So,
There's a lot of moving things, but it is an interesting topic that's quickly moving.
yeah. Is there anything that you would like to share with our listeners? Any resources, platform, call to actions?
Yeah, all of these tools that Commonland works on and uses are uh, open source, and right now we are continuing to develop them. We've been piloting them, so definitely call to reach out to if you have tools that you've been using that have been helpful.
Mhm.
We'd love to also try them out. If you want to participate or use the tools that we've been using, do reach out as well.
Great.
Especially landscape partners, who are interested in using them, or getting some support. I think that's what Commonland is really built for, acting as a service to landscape partnerships. So
Yeah. We will also put it into the show notes. Maybe a
great.
final, more personal question. So you basically your careers more started in the conventional financial area. So what has motivated you to do this work now?
I think what motivates me in the day to day, it's still the connection of what's happening on the ground. So for me, being able to connect with and to really understand what is happening and see and hear the great work that the landscape partners are doing. For example, Grupo Ecológico Sierra Gorda in Mexico or Albelal in the Altiplano. I think that is for sure the biggest motivator. They have the really difficult roles, and just, I don't know, supporting in from here in the way that we can, I think, is the main thing for me, and yeah, I would argue for most of, or for Commonland in general. Uh, yeah, and I think it's been taking a long time. The state right now, of course, look, state of the world, how things are moving.
Yeah.
The macro picture is sometimes, yeah, maybe quite challenging to hear about. And so these local initiatives that continue to move forward and, do great work with very
Yeah.
little is
Yeah.
really the
It's really
highlight of
encouraging. Yeah.
encouraging.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alejandro, for sharing your valuable insights.
Thank you for having me. No, pleasure. Nice chatting with you, Alexander.
Yeah. I think this conversation showed that with the right frameworks and the right capital, we have the chance to make large-scale restoration investable and feasible. It also shows that there are still a lot of struggle and challenges that we have to address. But yeah, it also revealed that there's a path forward. So to all our listeners, thank you very much for tuning in. Subscribe, share, and stay tuned for the next episode of Beyond the Canopy. Have a great day.